I'm gonna start shooting shit on this motherfucker. Yeah, nickel. Here we are. It's OGX Life Speaks. Um, Earlier on Facebook, what the fuck was I talking about? Oh, I was talking about psychological issues in relationship to or the psychological theory in relationship to why we as a people need autonomy or deserve autonomy because we're in a codependent relationship, and a codependent relationship is unhealthy. That any psychiatrist or psychologist or therapist is going to tell you that you need to divorce yourself or separate yourself from the individual in which you have this codependent relationship with. And we as African Americans have a codependent relationship with white America. And even multicultural America, if you really want to get into that. And we need to take into account this psychological issue that because our problem is psychological. This idea of spirit is just one, it's kind of a red herring, you know what I'm saying? It was designed, it is designed in order to get us focused on the wrong shit. You know, we've been, singing Negro spirituals for, 400 some odd years, and yet we just go further and further into oppression. So we need to start actually speaking about some black psychology and the roots of the African origins of biological psychiatry, in which they call religion. And that psychiatry or psychology is the basis of why we even have this thing called religion, and that it is a psychological practice that was that's referred to as hermetics within the Greek and Latin and then European tradition. It was called the science of the sound, and the African tradition, or the Egyptian and the Kemetic tradition. And you can see the Orisha, and you can see the Yoruba, and so forth, and you can see it in the Netter, and you can see it in Natarianism, the and even Gnosticism. This psychological tool in order to better navigate our environment in relationship to the mimetic and genetic trauma that our species has endured throughout our evolution. Just like we adore a certain level of trauma in our birth process, both our mother and us, the earth and us as a being, us as a species experience trauma in our evolution. And because of that trauma, we are experiencing a psychological backlash, a feedback loop, so to speak. And there is a certain methodology in order to counteract the negative effects of that trauma, and that is what we call religion, but is really a psychological tool. And man has the ability to graft his to alter his environment to make it more conducive to his survival. That's the payoff in relationship to the inadequacy of our physiology in relationship to this environment, because this environment is made to be conducive to a bipedal physiology, to a quadrupedic physiology, not a bipedal physiology, as we have. And so therefore, and these are my theories in relationship to what I'm talking about, autonomy. You know what I'm saying? These are viewpoints that are, that are found within the data collected by Western science, but not as Western science presents it in its academia. Its academia perception, our academic perception, has an ethnic agenda which denies or necessarily doesn't deny. It pretty much omits the interpretation of certain data because it doesn't benefit. But the data is there that I'm talking about. That's when I talk about this science in relationship to their science has collected a whole slew of data, in which is interpreted through an academia or my lighter through their particular academia, and that academia has their particular ethnic agenda associated with it. Like there are certain things that their academic agenda won't admit. Like their academic agenda won't admit that there was no historical Jesus Christ, that there never was an individual who was a historical Jesus Christ, and that the so-called Jewish people, you know, did not of antiquity did not exist as they exist within the Bible, and the Bible was not a historical point of reference. Now, there are certain aspects of their academia that will contradict itself within relationship to this, but it won't flat out admit that these things are entirely fabrications and that the Jews of antiquity were not European, because that doesn't match their, even though the data states this, the data states these things that they won't admit to within their academia, because their academia has an entirely different has their ethnic agenda at its forefront. And these are one of the psychological reasons why we deserve and need to have autonomy, because their academia, we can't receive a adequate education from their academic system because it has their ethnic agenda. So therefore, certain data is not going to be interpreted because it doesn't meet their ethnic agenda, or it's going to be misinterpreted to meet their ethnic agenda, and that is not to our benefit. And they don't. That's laws of power. They shouldn't have to alter their academia in order to appease our ethnic agenda. Our academia should appease our ethnic agenda, and we need our own academia in order to do that. No matter how, I mean, if our academia is based upon, is a more accurate interpretation of the data, doesn't matter. You know what I'm saying? At the end of the day, and I would argue that our interpretation of the data, my interpretation of the data, is a more accurate interpretation of the data that meets the ethnic agenda of the so-called African American here in the North American wilderness. So under the the oppression of the European. So that's basically where we're at in relationship to why I argue for this thing called autonomy. And I mean, this is the beginning of my OGX life speech. I'm gonna put up some of the other stuff that I did on Facebook, explaining the other, the views I have. I'm gonna go through all that video and try to, not try. I'm working on putting all that video up here so I can get that into context of what it is that we're trying, what we're not trying. We're working at explaining to our people in relationship to, first and foremost, the conscious community. That's who we want to speak to first and foremost is the conscious community. We want to have a open up a viable dialogue with members of the conscious community and start actually stop this chicken circuit shit and start actually getting down to the nuts and bolts of actually establishing a action plan and doing what needs to be done in order to, put things into action. Because as of now, we're really not putting things into action. You know what I'm saying? It's like, I have a pretty basic formula, or at least goals in which I want to achieve in the hopes of establishing our autonomy. First and foremost, what we're working on over here is a origin story, and I derive the idea of an origin story out of Jungian psychology, but also out of the works of Dr. Richard D. King, who wrote a series of books, but one of them is the African origins of